The next session would be an equally engaging topic, and of course, what more engaging could it be than Hyderabad itself? So the next session is going to be this book, the second of Manreet Sodhi Someshwar's Partition Trilogy. The first one was Lahore, and the second book is Hyderabad. And this is the session that we are going to have next. And in conversation with Manreet would be Suneetha. Many of you here know Suneetha and her association with Anveshi. She's a political theorist, interested in the politics of minorities, and she's a political theorist. And Suneetha has been associated with Anveshi for a long time, and particularly the question of women, question of gender and minorities, and she has worked a great deal on that. And so Suneetha will be in conversation with Manreet. We are starting the session now because, although there is in the schedule there's supposed to be a 5-minute break, we are already kind of slipped into it. So so the next session would be Manreet Sodhi Someshwar with her book titled Hyderabad, Book 2 of the Partition Trilogy, in conversation with Suneetha. May I request both Manreet and Suneetha to please take their chairs on the dais.
Thank you, Dr. Vijay. Thank you, Dr. Vijay. And welcome all of you on this Sunday morning. I'm delighted to be here with Manreet. And let me first congratulate her on writing this book, which is very important, which is very timely. I have a lot of questions. I hope I will finish in the required time so that we will spend 30 minutes in our conversation, and the 15 minutes would be for the audience questions. Shall we?
Yes, please. Thank you all for coming out on this Sunday morning. And I know Shah Rukh Khan is a tough act to follow, along with Shayana. So I'm hoping some of you will find your way back. But thank you to all who are here. And I'm looking forward to sort of the grilling by Suneetha, who knows probably as much about the subject as I do or more. So let's begin.
This is 47-48. The book focuses on 47-48, and that is perhaps the most complex year. Arguably the most complex year with in the history of, the 20th century Hyderabad's history, arguably in the sense that you talk about the complexity of the events in your acknowledgements. You say that it arises from the multiplicity of factors. Compared to your Lahore book, you say it's been much more complex. There is multiplicity of actors. There is events. The speed of the events was unimaginable and unprecedented. Being a researcher who has worked a little bit on that period, I know the messiness of these sources. There is so much written about that period from so many different perspectives. How did you actually navigate this messiness of the sources? How did you do your research?
Right, that's an excellent question, Suneetha. So let me just provide a little context for some of you who may not have read the books. As Dr. Kumar started, Lahore is book 1 of the Partition Trilogy, Hyderabad is book 2, and inshallah Kashmir will release later this year, which is book 3. So, I get asked very often, why is Bengal not there? In fact, when I was releasing Hyderabad, people did ask me, is this Hyderabad in Pakistan? So I think some context is required, for an appreciation of this discussion. So really what I'm looking at is in Lahore, I look at the 9 months leading up to the independence and partition of India. And then once 15th August arrived, there were 3 princely states which had not acceded to India yet, which was Kashmir, Hyderabad and Junagadh. Now, Junagadh gets resolved very quickly, and I cover that in Hyderabad, book 2. But Kashmir, as we know, is a festering sort of sore with us till this day. And Hyderabad got resolved in a manner that people have forgotten the story entirely. For further context, I'm married into a South Indian family, and I remember that from very early on, the notion, the narrative was that the south of India has nothing to do with the partition of India. And the story of Hyderabad is set in the Deccan, which is as South Indian as it gets. So really what I am interested in the Partition Trilogy is looking at what I call very disruptive partitions. Bengal did partition, but at least till 1971, the flow of people east and west continued in a largely non-violent manner. Whereas in Punjab, which is where Lahore is set, within 3 months, about 15 million people had migrated one way or the other. In the case of Hyderabad, Hyderabad was invaded, occupied, seized, or acceded to India in September of 1948. And the Kashmir story is still ongoing. So that's how thematically they are tied up. Now to come to your very specific question about resources. One is that I come from a small border town on the border between India and Pakistan. It is called Firozpur. By the laws of India's partition, it should have gone to Pakistan because it was Muslim majority. But it did not. And therein, I think, lies a lot of the reasons why I became a writer. I did not train to be a writer. I went to engineering school. I went to IIM Calcutta. I had a corporate career. But my adolescence did coincide with what is called the lost decade of Punjab, which is actually a 15-year period popularly called the Sikh militancy. And suffice to say that when 1984 happened, in our hometown, people said, and I'll say it in Punjabi and then translate, "Eta santali hai." This is 47 all over again. Certainly in Punjab, the numbers 47 and 84 are a shorthand for something much larger, for very large narratives. And I felt at a point that these were stories that I wanted to tell. So I have been engaged with studying partition for 20 years now. That's how I really started my writing. And that's when I came across what is, in the few accounts that we do have, called Operation Polo, which is sort of a British colonial term where it's called operation to indicate that it is very much a domestic affair. It has nothing to do with outsiders. And the kind of victorious narrative of how the Iron Man of India had managed to take this large part of India within India. Probably correct to an extent, but as with everything, there is a lot of grayness to that account, and that fascinated me. And as I said, the South Indian narrative of, we don't have a partition story, and I was, hell yeah, you do. So in terms of resources, for me, a lot of it has been just going back to, I started with going back to my hometown, speaking with sort of people who had witnessed what had happened during partition, and doing my own oral narratives. Because we do not have too many of those. Certainly in Punjab we don't. And that's how my journey began. For the specific case of Hyderabad, as you say, and I do mention in my acknowledgements, in the 3 books there are 2 parallel threads. There is the Delhi thread, in which Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel, and Lord Mountbatten are the protagonists. And what I mean is that they are actual characters like you would have in a novel. So For me, the first Prime Minister of India is Jawahar, there is Vallabh, and there is Dicky. And I'm writing the stories from inside their head. So what I'm trying to show is what historians call put on the same stage the elite and the subaltern. So the decisions which are being taken in Delhi, how do they impact the Aam Aadmi and Aurat in Lahore, in Hyderabad, in Kashmir? So that is the attempt. And in the case of Hyderabad, the situation gets terribly complicated because you have first the Nizam, who is also the wealthiest man in the world. He's probably Elon Musk on steroids. You know, that is the kind of wealth he has. Hyderabad is also the largest princely state because it's not just Hyderabad and Telangana. It has parts of the current states of Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, what is now Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka. So it's really a very large geographic area as well. And then there are a term we use currently called competitive communalism, because we do have a volunteer Muslim army notionally, which is the Razakars, but there is also the Arya Samaj and the Hindu Mahasabha. So, you know, they are players as well in this. And then there is a burgeoning peasant movement, the Telangana peasant movement. A lot of people think of communism in India today and they think of Bengal and Kerala. And that chapter again of Telangana's history has kind of been, been dusted over. So that is happening as well. And all these factors are at play in Hyderabad, the princely state of 1947. So there is a big concern of Vallabhbhai Patel, who is the Deputy Prime Minister and the Home Minister, that it is possible with this burgeoning communist movement. China is very interested in what is happening. And remember, we see the map of India as it is today. And we assume that this is the map that the British left us. And we couldn't be far from the truth. The British had no interest in the territorial integrity of India. So what they did was, by the laws of India's partition, first, to sit back, Indias were two Indias. One was the India which is directly controlled and run by the British government. And then there was the princely India. And this was roughly 45% of the landmass. There was 565 princely states. And each of them had the right to accede to India or Pakistan or stay independent. And therefore, this decision, when it came through, which is middle of May, we literally, Vallabhbhai Patel had, ably assisted by his secretary, VP Menon, literally had 3 months in which to stitch those princely states back into India. And just to make it real for you, about 300 of those states were in what is currently the state of Gujarat. There's a large part of Gujarat called Saurashtra, which literally means 100 nations, which is from where Jinnah, Mahatma Gandhi, and Sardar Patel all hail. So if you were today, assuming those princely states had not been knitted into India, if you were to travel from Bombay to Ahmedabad, you would probably need to stop at more than 15 or 20 checkpoints and have your visa processed before you could go further. So that is the kind of scenario we're looking at. So the British did not leave India as we got it. It had to be stitched together. So come 15th August 1947, Vallabhbhai Patel is looking at what he calls the belly of India, which is Hyderabad, and the crown of India, which is Kashmir, which have still decided that we're going to make up our mind which way we're going to go. And this is a very long-winded answer, but all those complicating factors existed, and I did what I always do, which is go to the libraries, go to the archives, and I'm fortunate that I live in New York City, which has an excellent public library network. I'm a fellow, and what it does is it allows me to access books which would be, let's say, in the records of all the Ivy League universities, and you can request for the material to be brought home. But again, just to bring home the point of how long I have tussled with these resources, my daughter turned 20 this year. She was 8 or 9, and I heard her telling a friend, all the dead men are my mother's good friends. So, I have been tussling with these for a very long time, including the Nizam.
I had a kind of supplementary question about... Yeah, about what you said about the partition. Hyderabad story is never thought of as partition. Hyderabad story is never thought of as, no, it's not working. Is never thought of as story of partition, and even for regional histories, even for people who are here, it is. It's a story that is a matter of a sort of autonomy, a sort of loss of one's identity. It has figured as all of these. The integration question itself has been, the integration of the Hyderabad state into Indian Union itself, even now, it arouses enough and because it is there is a that accompanied it, and there is the suppression of the peasant movement, one of the biggest and most widespread peasant movements in the country, in the world perhaps. So how is it that, this partition and this kind of, how did you think of bringing these together, this whole complexity?
Yeah, let me see if I can give a simple answer. It's a very profound question. And I think even when you look at, let's say, Punjab, we have what is, in Punjab we still call West Punjab, which the rest of India considers Pakistan. And, East Punjab, which is where my hometown is, where I was a week back. And I think any partition, as I said, because I'm looking at very violent disruptions, what it does is it puts a line on the ground and says, it's us and them. But if you really look at it, the line is drawn on a cultural soil of certainly 2 millennia. And what I'm trying to say is that, let me try and give a couple of examples to illustrate what I'm trying to say here. So one is my own experience. As I said, I grew up in a border town, and my father is that generation where he was taught Urdu and English. So Punjabi is my mother tongue, we speak it, but he never learned to write it. Urdu was the script which was taught. And my father was a lawyer, and even in his case notes, he would scribble on the margins, his notes would be in English and Urdu. And when I was growing up in my household, we had transmission from Lahore, which was superior to then Doordarshan in Amritsar. So I grew up on Pakistani TV series, the music. In our house, it was very common for, evening 6:30 would be the ghazal hour. And what I'm trying to say is that though there is a line which divides us, the cultural milieu probably to a large extent stays the same, to the extent that, in New York, when our friends say that it's very surprising, all the Punjabis are good friends with the Pakistanis and not so much with the rest of India, but that's the culture that I'm talking about. Similarly, in the case of Hyderabad, for instance, in my novel Hyderabad, I end with what a communist says towards the end. He says, we got what we wanted, but we lost what we had. And he's referring to this very syncretic culture, which is neither Muslim or Hindu, or it is a way of being which comes when layer upon layer of culture has been added to it. And Hyderabad, Dakhan, the entire milieu is of a certain culture. And I think a lot of the disruptions of partition, what they did was they tried to take those culture into sections and say, this is mine and this is yours. For instance, when I was researching, I read the same thing was happening in Punjab as in Hyderabad. You could not make out by a person's dress whether they were Hindu or Muslim or, Sikh or a Pathan. You couldn't. And why would you? because culturally, we are the same. And I do not want to talk about how nowadays we are asked to identify people, by the clothes they wear. So this is a very, very deep-rooted place that we come from, and that's why I feel these violent disruptions, what they do is they leave a vacuum, and unless in our storytelling we engage with that vacuum, we are just going to buy into that narrative of us and them, which when you really start digging doesn't exist. Because when we listen to other people's stories, we realize, oh, they're not so different from us. And certainly in Hyderabad, for instance, one of the things I want to mention in the Nizam's court, in the Asaf Jahis, there was this, we have memed this a lot, but there was this culture of courtesy, extreme courtesy, So there was a popular phrase that you could stab somebody in the back, but you could not be rude to them on their face. It was that kind of thing. And I just want to remind, since we have to laugh about these things, the tehzeeb, right? Which was Lucknow on steroids again. So there is a poet from the Dakhan court called Amir Minai. And his ghazal, when I mention the name, you will immediately recognize, was sung by Gulzar Saab in the 80s and became hugely popular. It's called Ahista Ahista. I'm sure you remember it. So in that the poet says, and I think to me that sums up the tehzeeb of Hyderabad. He says, वो बेदर्दी से सर काटे अमीर और मैं कहूँ उनसे Huzur ahista, Janab ahista. So, in English, he's talking about his beloved who is sort of metaphorically beheading him. And he is pleading to her, go slow, my love, go slow. So that is a kind of courtesy and tehzeeb and the extreme decorum that we're talking about in Hyderabad.
One thing that I was struck by in the novel is the way you bring to life not only Nehru, Patel, Mountbatten, but several, what you say, the lay people, right? And in that narrative, you bring in the conflicting, whereas at the same time conflicting coalescing interests of these varied actors from Arya Samaj to communists to Ittihad to women who have been sold, who have been given away as gifts in this. So this commonality of their locations are very different, their ideologies are different, but their interests somewhere coalesce at this point of time. So I was very struck by that and really admired, because that is what, as a researcher, actually I have come across, that the Andhra Mahasabha, which was the parent organization of all these groups, had everybody from left to right. Hindu Mahasabha to communists were all members of the Andhra Mahasabha. And the most interesting thing and the clarity that with which you bring this is the role of the Arya Samaj in the communal question of Hyderabad state, because what has remained over the decades and what has been memorialized is the communalism of the Ittihad. Whereas to any researcher who reads, anybody who actually looks at this period, is the role of the Arya Samaj, and which is very, very crucial, critical to talk about at this point. How did you do that?
Yeah, I'm glad you're asking that specific question, because as I said, the Hyderabad was rife with what a term we use currently called competitive communalism. So, as is broadly understood, the Muslims were considered as converts. They were Hindus at one point of time, and they had been converted into Muslims. So Now, how the question arises, how do you get a Muslim back into the Hindu fold? Because you kind of have to be born a Hindu, right? You can't become a Hindu. But then the Arya Samaj very innovatively came up with these Shuddhi ceremonies. So they would actually, cajole, coax, threaten, lure Muslims, especially the lower income Muslims, and try and perform Shuddhi ceremonies. And literally it was, a tally of numbers being kept. I have converted so many to my fold and I have converted so many to the other. The Razakars get all the press, a large part of it negative, and rightly so, because I think Qasim Razvi is quite an extraordinary character. He is, the Nizam, when you read about him, by that point in time, is a very Lear-like character, Shakespeare's King Lear. He's quixotic, he's eccentric, and in my narrative, I'm also trying to show how a person like the Nizam, who's the wealthiest man in the world, who literally has everything going for him, who's also considered the numero uno amongst India's princess, right? And for his legal, and he's in his right by the laws of partition to say, look, I'm going to be independent. So, or I'll accede to Pakistan, which is Vallabhbhai's biggest fear. Because imagine then, Hyderabad as we know today is part of Pakistan. And Jinnah has a keen interest in Hyderabad because what is the need of any new nation? It is money, it is wealth. You need to build your resources. So there is a tandem between them. And what the Nizam does is he gets what is at that time considered the sharpest legal counsel in the world, Walter Monckton, who had advised the King Edward who abdicated. He had advised him. So Walter Monckton is the person who is negotiating with Dicky Mountbatten and V.P. Menon on behalf of Vallabhbhai Patel. So when you lay it out on paper, there is no reason for the Nizam to lose. He has everything going for him. And yet, in the end, he does. So in my narrative, I'm also trying to show, I structure it like a chessboard because there are these moves that each of these parties is making. And in the end, the Nizam loses, and a large part of the onus of that lies on Qasim Razvi. Because Razvi is a person who is larger than life. He may remind us of many politicians of today who speak in very demagogic terms, in terms of what they can do, and inflame the audience. And he kind of fed into the Nizam's head this narrative that, the entire Islamic Ummah will support us, Egypt will send forces, Pakistan will have its planes flying in if India even tries to invade us. And, this entire sort of narrative is what then lets the Nizam down, because Walter Monckton at each stage is bringing to him proposals which, if had gone through, Hyderabad today would decidedly look very different. But it didn't, because, as I said, Qasim Razvi, and Qasim Razvi is an extraordinary character. He was a lawyer from Nanded. He was, if you look at some of the caricatures which were made at that point in time, he's shown with this flaming hair, with these bulging eyes, very Rasputin-like character, and that's what he was. And I think a large amount of the press that Razakars get is because of him, whereas we don't have an equivalent figure in the Arya Samaj or the Mahasabha. Try mine.
The moment I do something. This is a question following upon what you have said, that there is this atmosphere in which there are several actors and there is a whole lot of things that are happening. Hyderabad also had a very vibrant political atmosphere, which is about civil rights, in the sense that there is Suravaram Pratap Reddy, who was running this magazine called Golconda, and then you had Andhra Mahasabha. There are protests for social reform, eradication of untouchability, etc., etc. I was struck by, yes, the thing about your novel is it's a race. It's very racy and it's extremely readable. And for people who do not have the idea of actually what are the events that led to this, it gives a very clear picture, and it does an extremely brilliant job of doing it. It's fair. It has clarity about the motives, motivations, uncertainties, conflicts of each of these actors, and that way it is brilliant. But you also, as a novelist, you have chosen to bring in certain other events, like for instance Satyagraha of 38 Satyagraha into this period. I was wondering, why is it that you do not bring, why did you choose or did you think about this vibrant atmosphere of the larger social reform atmosphere, larger debates that were happening? There were, the consultations, discussions between Congress and the Ittihad about responsible government, so many things that happened. How did you consciously not bring in, how is it that...
Yes, that would be another Mahabharata, and I'm not Vyasa. But it's an excellent question in terms of, how does a novelist structure a novel? And the analogy I like to use is that of a landscape painter. When you look at a landscape, there are a million things. There could be this bird which is chittering on the tree, there are the leaves, there are different kinds of leaves, then there are people and, the way the light falls on a certain leaf. So what a landscape painter does is to step back and say, what do I want to focus on? So, and at the outset I want to say this is my story of Hyderabad, and there are million stories. There is never one story on partition, and I think if it encourages more people to write, kudos to them, because that is certainly my attempt to tell a story of Hyderabad the way I see it. So in my reckoning, with all three novels in the Partition Trilogy, besides putting the subaltern and the elite on the same stage, there's another thing that I'm trying to do, which is really bring women front and center. And that is not ahistorical, it's just that our history is very much his story. And the role that women have played in these narratives has kind of been blurred, entirely forgotten. And my attempt is to sort of seek women out of the interstices and put them front and center. Also, when I'm writing historical fiction, there is a dramatic arc. So there is a when you read about this time period, it is a thriller. Because literally there are these negotiations happening and nobody knows who's going to erupt. The Razakars are doing one thing here. And just for the audience to keep in mind, Kashmir is happening at the very same time. So our leaders of this new nation are facing these twin challenges. There's Kashmir in the north and there's Hyderabad happening in the Deccan at the same time. However, if I were to put them both of the narratives in one, I don't think the human mind can grasp it. Also, they're two very splendid, entirely different stories, and each, I think, deserves its own sort of interpretation. So what I did therefore was to decide to focus on some of the political elements. For instance, I'm trying to show how even the communists are not uniform, right? There's the Hyderabad state communists, the Indian communists. Everybody wants something different. There are so many negotiations happening between and amongst them. And I'm also trying to show, as I said, the women, because I feel, and I'm going to stick my neck out here, I feel a lot of the male writers, when they write women, they pit women against one another, which is not the lived sort of experience of women. So I have women, for instance,
Jabili and Uzma.
Yes.
They're fantastic characters.
Right.
It is, for those of you who haven't read, Jabili is a woman who is given in gift, is a backward caste woman, and Uzma is another woman who's been given away into the court to be a taster of, food. And both of them play a key role in this novel. And Jabili's character reminds me of the women who are written in We Were Making History. The history that has been brought out by Sri Shakti Sangatna, an autonomous feminist group in this part. And some of the women, the whole questions that they raised about equality, the possibility of equality at that point during the peasant movement. And your novel brings it out so beautifully.
Thank you. And I'm also trying to show how, women's relationship, sorority, extends across castes and classes. And one of the first chapters is with three women, which is Nilufar, who's the princess of the Nizam. She's Nizam's younger daughter-in-law. There is her friend Emily, who's an English woman, and there is Uzma, who, as you say, was given to Nilufar as a taster. She literally tastes the food to see if it's poisoned, in which case it's okay for her to die because the princess will survive, But we had people like that in the courts. And I'm trying to show how there is a level of friendship that can exist amongst women, which has nothing to do with caste or class or even ethnic backgrounds. And therefore, these are my interests when I write a novel. As I said, somebody else writing may see it differently and bring those aspects to the front.
Now let me ask some little more things that I wish the novel has done. See, when I read, as a reader, I could see, the anxieties, the uncertainties, some sort of thought processes of all these actors, major actors, Nehru, VP Menon, various things that they're doing. But that is something I did not get. I wished you had done that with Osman Ali Khan, because he's not I know he's not an easy figure. I know he is this big figure, but he's also been part of modernization of Hyderabad, set up universities, was doing planning, sort of planning exercises for the Hyderabad state. There is something what is the interiority of Osman Ali Khan that I wish to know, because as a researcher it is really difficult, but as a novelist you had the chance. So how is it that I didn't get that from?
Okay, I'm sorry, I'll beg to differ here, because I begin the novel with Nizam and I end it with him. And to me, he's a very, very central character. And he's one of the toughest persons that I had to grapple with when writing about him, because a lot of the accounts of the Nizam come from the British record keepers, from Walter Monckton's diaries, from Conrad Corfield's diaries, who do see him as a certain, I wouldn't use the word caricature, but they do see him as a certain set, princely, wealthy figure. And for me, I was trying to, as you said, which unfortunately you didn't get, but I was trying to get into his head and try and understand. And I don't want to give it away. I would urge you to read the novel, because there is a distinct break that happens. The Nizam, as you said, was very progress-oriented. He founded Osmania University. I mean, there's so many things. But there is a point of time in his life when there is a snap. And I think, when I was researching, I thought that was the reason why the Nizam had become the person he had in the last 10, 12 years of his life, which was the reason why, when these negotiations were happening, if he had been the earlier Nizam, it would have taken a very different turn. So I don't want to give it away, but,
Yeah, true. Huh? Yeah, sorry. Yeah. I just had one more question and then we would open. The one thing that I was looking for in a novel of this kind is, yes, there are, the novel discusses and really brings to light the anxieties of several kinds of actors at that point. Somewhere I was thinking that there are movements that bring to, as the novel says, there are interests that cut across caste, religion and class also. But there is something that I thought was a little, even Razvi's character or whoever, there was an anxiety of Muslims who were getting minoritized at that point. So somewhere I thought that I wished the novel had said a little more about that.
Okay, I'll take your feedback.
The session is open for, there are 2, 3, 4, 5.
See who she's on.
Oh.
Hi, I'm Suneetha. I have 2 questions. One is, how do you distance yourself as a writer from a memory? Like when someone tells you about partition, how do you distance yourself and write? Or how do you, chronicleize that? That's one thing, because I'm encountering a lot of memory studies and, everybody talks about the partition, but I don't know how invested you are in the memory. And as a writer, do you distance or, I don't know, what is the process? That's one question. The second that I would ask is, for me, partition literature is very different from references to partition. For example, if you remember the film Queen, she's sitting outside the door, the grandmother, and telling the granddaughter about an experience during partition. She met someone in a tent. There is a reference. It's not like, she's talking about the entirety of it. It's just a reference. So when you write, do you factor those in as well? These are my 2 questions.
No, I'll try and answer your questions. The first one, I have a very definitive answer. The second one, I'm not so sure, but let me try. So, no, I do not distance myself from any of the memories. I see myself as a memory keeper. I wouldn't be writing these books if I didn't see myself as that. I would be very surprised if any writer, certainly of fiction, said that they do not engage with memory. That is our storehouse. As I said, I have spent years talking to survivors of partition, and it is not easy to get stories out of them. To equip myself, I enrolled in trauma classes to understand how these things are processed, how do you gather these narratives, how do you deal with them. And there was a doctor I came across, he was probably middle-aged at the time, who was dealing with a lot of these patients. And he told me that the best antidote to life is good health and poor memory. And then he turned to me and said, but you don't have it, so you can be a writer. So, writers don't have that privilege. And your second question, was about... yes. Sorry, say that again? It was... Yeah, I just want to leave a thought here. I think what we have in this country is a lot of sentimentalizing around partition. I will get a forward WhatsApp from somebody has received from Lahore and they will be shedding tears and, all this piety about it. We have to stop that. The past doesn't want us to get sentimental. It wants us to interrogate the past, to ask questions. Unless we do that, we are just going to, as you said, these will be references, these will be stories you hear. You will never feel it. The only way to feel it is to start asking questions. And that is when we are going to get some answers.
I think Suneetha covered it. I just wanted to ask you if you could share some of your experiences of dealing with people, grappling with people other than the dead people you were dealing with, and how was it having grown up in Firozpur? I don't think it was that much of a distance from what had happened in 1947. Was it very difficult to combine history and fiction together, since you talk about historical fiction? I haven't read your book. I will now, of course, but I was just curious as a writer. Thank you. It was amazing just listening to you speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Pankaja. They're excellent questions. I'll answer the first. If I forget the second one, please remind me. So your first question was about, sort of the people that I met during... I met a lot of people. I started with my own family, started extending it outwards. I come, as I said, from a small town. And our favorite sweet shop was called Kasuriyan di Hatti. Hatti is a store, a shop in Punjabi, and Kasuriyan di Hatti. So, I never paid any heed to it when I was growing up. It was just a like a Ramesh bookstore, it's a name. But when I started sort of connecting the dots and I felt this need to write the stories, I understood. Kasuriyan refers to a place called Kasur. Kasur lies on the midpoint between Firozpur and Lahore. If you, were to write down, Kasur is the birthplace of Baba Bulle Shah, who is sort of the patron saint of Punjab. And this was clearly a family who had fled. And in memory, as homage to that hometown, they called it Kasuriyan di Hatti. So, these were gems. My hometown and the narratives were littered with these gems, which I was coming across over and over. And I'll just add to that, a lot of times in partition studies, which is a very, very small amount of narrative that we have, people tend to compare it with the Jewish Holocaust. And while I do not believe that traumas need to be compared and contrasted, but for the sake of understanding, it helps, to look at the Irish Troubles, the apartheid, and then you place the partition in that. But I remember when I was doing this research, I always felt something was not right. There was something which was not sitting correct. And I remember there was a Sikh elderly gentleman who said something to me, and the penny dropped for me. And I will say it in Punjabi and then translate in English. And he said, Putter kise de haath saaf nahi. So he said, in this narrative, nobody's hands are clean. And just to break it up, in the Jewish Holocaust, there are very clear villains, the Nazis, and victims or survivors, which are the Jewish. But in Punjab, which had the kind of syncretic culture which Hyderabad, Dakhan had, it was literally brother turned against brother. So, which is one reason why it is so difficult to talk about it. Because amongst our grandparents are people, men especially, who killed their own women folk. And when I say women folk, there are cases. And Urvashi Batalia has a case where this person lines up women from the age of 80 to 8 months old and shot them dead. So there is violence which is being committed against women in the family and women outside the family. So it's a very, very complicated legacy. It's very difficult to talk about. And your second question dealt with... Yeah. That's an excellent question because, writing historical fiction currently in India is not the easiest thing. You can write fantasy, ideally cast it in that, and nobody will ask you a question. So I'm very glad for the support of my publisher, HarperCollins. But what I do is, as I said, I tussled with this material for a very long period of time, and I was looking for how do I tell these stories. I do not want to do narrative non-fiction because I think stories are the best way for us to connect. And I think there should be 1 million more partition stories. Each story is important. And then we had just moved to New York City, and I came across this professor. Her name is Sadia Hartman. She teaches at Columbia University, and she grapples with the history of the African Americans in the U.S. So she's developed a structure. It is called critical fabulation. So what you do is you take a scaffolding which is built through rigorous, hard research. And then for the purpose of storytelling, you start padding it with imaginative fictions. So even the Delhi thread, of course, everything which is within the courts is something which is in the archives, it's certified, it's been said and done. Even the common people, the Aam Aadmi and Aurat, they are composites. They are people who actually existed. Like Jabali, when you read the Telangana peasant movement, she looks extraordinary on the page, but there were so many such extraordinary women who were doing these things. And my attempt, therefore, is really to bring those women on page. In many times, for the sake of dramatic arc, they're composites. So Jabali may be a sum of 2 or 3 women's experiences, which I am congealing in one person. So I hope that answered your question.
What was the word you used? Fabulation.
Critical fabulation. You can look her up, Sadia Hartman.
Who else? Next.
The other people? There is other person.
So right, second row, the gentleman with that.
And at the back also.
Thank you. Ma'am, I have a question about, I've read many books on partition, but you as a writer also, going through all the partition history, have you felt that there were only few players in this process of getting the partition done? There was no such thing as a referendum kind of thing, and people got involved in it. I mean, the people in general. Now, the problem is we, the young generation or the generation after the partition, are facing a lot of consequences of that partition because there was no such involvement of people itself. These were politicians at the top, 3 or 4 people, the actors doing it. And there were no logistics, no planning that caused so much of massacre, so much of bloodshed and all that. So, and the partition thing is still going on. I mean, there is a Telangana partition, there's a partition of Bangladesh, there's a partition. Still, I mean, it's a process going on. Are we learning any lessons from these partitions or not? How do you as a writer feel about this question?
Thank you. I think you are voicing a lot of the questions that I myself as a writer think about, engage with, and I think a lot of Indians currently are engaging with as well. I feel that there is a narrative in place. For instance, we are celebrating in India the 75th year of independence, and there is very little talk really about partition. But partition is the cost of independence. It is the price we paid to get free. And for my specific project of the Partition Trilogy, what I'm doing is I do not focus on Mahatma Gandhi or Jinnah because I think too much has been written about them already. And my project for that specific time period is really to look at the time period when the last Viceroy arrives in India and a year after independence. So Dicky Mountbatten stayed on as the first Governor General of India, and then he left in the summer of 1948. And the reason I'm looking at that time period is because I feel there is a lack of information on that period. When I was growing up, there were maybe a couple of pages on partition in my history textbooks. None of them spoke about what I heard on a daily basis in my hometown, where every home had a partition story or more. The only time I felt I had seen that was when I read Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan, which I came to very late in life. So, and I met a friend at the Jaipur Literature Festival whose son is in high school, and she said in the CBSE textbooks now there is one paragraph on partition. So, I really do not know how to answer your question except to say that in terms of the British legacy, the divide and rule, the us and them had already come into play. So by the time 1947 rolls in and Dicky Mountbatten comes, partition in people's minds has already happened. It is just a question of executing it. And of course the execution was botched, it was horrendous. But it is alternative history. We do not know. Civil war had already broken out in Punjab. As early as March, there were reports coming in of massacres happening, of gangs. And there's a large role which is played by soldiers. Punjab is considered a militant, again a term which the British gave. They gave this term that you are a martial race to the Sikhs and to the Punjabi Muslims. Now, do you get a more inflammable sort of portion than in Punjab, because the soldiers were not demobilized, which means that they still had their weapons with them. And when this narrative began that, this is going to be Lahore, is going to be in India, or is it going to be in Pakistan, then one way soldiers know is how to assert through violence, through the use of weapons. And but it's a very good question, and I wish that each one of us engages with it. And one reason I wrote the Partition Trilogy, I didn't know when I was researching that I think it's very relevant and very contemporary, and it asks questions which I wish we would all ask of ourselves.
One last question. Sir.
Hello, I'm Dr. Arif. You made a very good point about, and I'm glad you described very well about Qasim Rizvi, because he needs to be described that way. The other thing was about the Nizam. Okay, you made a few points like about he had the best of the lawyer, and your whole thing is about the Nizam. And the third point you made was, if you would have had his way, Hyderabad would have been totally different and all. That's the point you made. My question to you is, was it not a tragedy on the part of such a big person like the Nizam, okay, that he did not look into the practical side of it? He had to believe in a lawyer, because lawyers think in a different way as from a politician, okay? Because they don't look from the practical side of things, they look at the legal side of it. And looking at it, the whole thing was very impractical for this state to be as an independent or forget part of Pakistan, because it had no seaport and was completely surrounded by India.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. What you're saying, very often logic, the way we think, does not necessarily play out when we have to take decisions. And I would urge you to read the book, because that's what I'm trying to show, why a person like the Nizam, who has everything going for him, ends up losing everything. And I just want to quote, which is in the book, so Walter Monckton, at the last time when he fails to get the Nizam to listen to reason, because it's the Nizam's choice. Does he want to listen to the Razakar? Does he want to listen to Monckton? Or does he want to exercise his own mind? It's his choice, right? And when Walter Monckton brings to him what looks like a good deal on paper, and most lawyers would agree was, he still turns it down. So, I call it, he has an ongoing mushaira with Delhi, which is what then Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel at some point says we have to put a pause to it. But Walter Monckton is having a secret conversation with Dicky Mountbatten, because, they are very intimate with each other. And he actually quotes from Shakespeare, and he says, "Those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad." So I will leave you with that thought.
That's the last question.
I noticed that you said partition for Lahore, but in Hyderabad it's integration, and it's quite likely that in Kashmir it will be part integration, part partition. But the question I have is this: how difficult or how different has it been to talk about the partition background in Lahore and the integration undercurrent here in Hyderabad?
I have to ask you a question back. Did you attend the whole session, sir?
Sorry?
Did you attend the whole session?
Yeah, I was there the whole session.
Okay, so I have not spoken about integration. For me, Hyderabad is very much a partition story, and as is Kashmir. So you will have to read the novels to figure out what I'm trying to say. Thank you.